so much for that kind introduction, and I really feel honored to be here today. And I am going to be talking about a new research project, which I have just completed a book manuscript with a co-author named Erdem Aytaç, who is a former PhD student at Yale and now teaches at Koç University in Istanbul. So the working title of our book is Why Bother? Rethinking Participation in Elections and Protests. And I have to say that I love the way you said the word bother. The title actually came from a conversation with a non-academic British friend who I explained what we were trying to do, and she said, "Oh, you mean why bother?" So that became our title, so delighted to hear it said so well. So if turnout had edged up among young British voters on June 23, 2016, the UK might have decided to remain in the European Union. If turnout had been higher in parts of Michigan, Pennsylvania, and Wisconsin on November 8, 2016, Hillary Clinton might have become the 45th president of the United States. I have to tell you that I had to promise my family I was not going to take the time here to apply for political asylum. If a wave of protests had not taken off in Kiev in the winter of 2013-14, the government of Viktor Yanukovych might have remained in power instead of falling, as it did in February 2014. Russia would not have invaded Crimea later that month, and war would not have broken out in eastern Ukraine, at least not then. So variation in political participation, in levels of political participation, can alter the course of history. Social scientists have developed many theories of participation in elections, protests, and other forms of collective action, but these theories are not entirely persuasive. In our study, Erdem and I develop a theory of popular participation that rests on what we think are plausible assumptions, and our theory makes sense of real-world observations. We then test this theory in the context of two major types of action that citizens, and actually for that matter residents in some contexts, have available to them in democracies: voting and protesting. So what I'm going to do in the talk is briefly review several theories of participation, their strengths and their shortcomings. I'll then present our alternative, a theoretical framework that, with some modifications, helps explain people's choices to take part or not take part in elections, and their choices to take part or not take part in demonstrations or protests. Then I'm going to take a little time to convey a sense of how we've tested our theory empirically, and there isn't time to go into that entirely, but I'll do a bit of that. Our testing takes place in a range of settings with diverse kinds of data. We study electoral turnout behavior drawing on secondary literature from democracies all over the world, and we analyze original data from the US and surveys of verified turnout in the UK. And we study protest participation, again from starting with a rich secondary literature. We analyze individual level data from survey organizations in several countries. We also conducted surveys and survey experiments in several countries in which large social movements had or were occurring at or around the time of our research, and those countries are Brazil, Turkey, and Ukraine. We conducted interviews with protest organizers and activists, demonstrators, line policemen involved, and civilian officials. So what are the facts that a good theory needs to explain? One is that people do indeed participate. Collective action problems don't keep everyone off the streets and away from the polling places. A second is that the more we care about the outcome, the more likely we are to participate. This is intuitive, and there's a lot of evidence, good social science evidence, that it's true in both elections and in protests, but there's surprisingly little theoretical support of it. A third fact that has to do with the impact of people's participation on a person's willingness to take part. This matters, but not for the reasons that theorists usually point to. A final fact to be explained has to do with the ambiguous impact of costs of participation on people's willingness to take part. It's self-evident that when costs of participation rise, people's willingness to take part declines, all else equal. That's practically the definition of costs. And yet, events or actions that raise costs of participation sometimes have very little effect, or even are followed by increases in participation. So a good starting place for this discussion is William Riker and Peter Orderschuk's calculus of voting model. They offer a decision rule that determines whether a person would go to the polls. They were studying voting, but keep in mind that elections are a special case of public goods. Collective action problems potentially stymie protest participation as well. Riker and Orderschuk relate R, the rewards of voting, to P, which is the probability that a would-be voter's vote will be pivotal, changing the outcome of the election. B, the relative utility benefits to the voter of her preferred candidate prevailing over an opponent. And finally, C, the material and cognitive costs of voting. The costs of transportation, the opportunity costs of the time spent going to the polls, cognitive effort in figuring out whom to vote for, and so on. Riker and Orderschuk point out that the right-hand side of this equation is generally negative. The probability of an election ending in a tie in an electorate that is larger than 100 people is basically 0. Therefore, P is equivalent to 0, the product PB is equivalent to 0, and costs are positive, so no one should vote. Riker and Orderschuk dealt with this very serious anomaly by positing that people are brought back to the polls by a civic duty to vote, which they use the letter D to signify. Now, we may or may not be satisfied with this solution and with this way of modeling the role of norms in people's participation decisions. But notice that this modification leaves unaltered the implication that B, the differential benefit we expect to enjoy from the outcome of collective action, plays no role. How much you care about whether a social democrat wins an election, or a Christian Democrat, or a neo-Nazi, or whether your country remains or exits from an international community, none of this makes any difference in your decision whether to vote. Subsequent theories of electoral participation carried this same implication. I'll just mention a few of these. So expressive voting models, and I'm drawing here on the work of Schussler and Brennan and Lomaski, also imply that the what's at stake in an individual's view in the outcome of an election doesn't matter in their decisions to take part. The same can be said of shaming models, for example, Gerber and co-authors. Now, there are several models in which potential voters are brought back to the polls through the mobilization efforts or inducements of another actor. The agent of mobilization might be a group leader, as envisioned by Sacher and Nailboff, Uhlaner, or Morton. The groups are small enough in number and command a large enough following in the electorate that their leaders' efforts can make a real difference in the outcome of the election. B matters to the agent of mobilization, but not to the would-be voter he or she mobilizes. There are difficulties with these models, these group and mobilization models. As Tim Feddersen has pointed out, the leaders have to be conceived of as coercing or offering selective incentives to their followers. If not, then collective action problems reemerge. In other models, the agent of mobilization is more diffuse, such as a person's social network. There have been important recent contributions along these lines by Mary Rolfe and Betsy Sinclair. But in these models, mobilizing voters does not mean persuading them that they should care about the outcome. It has more to do with social pressure and with shaming. An obvious agent of mobilization is the political party and campaigns. I'll show you evidence in a minute suggesting that campaign mobilization efforts can't be the whole story, explaining why people turn out or stay at home. So one has to ask, does it really make sense that campaigns mobilize voters without trying to persuade them that B is large, that they care about the result? In fact, political campaigns spend a lot of time engaged in just this kind of persuasion. And that's partly persuasion to get people to vote for their candidate, but it's also persuasion to get them to go to the polls. So to illustrate this, we coded 1,266 statements in stump speeches by 18 US presidential candidates who ran for office between 1980 and 2012. We coded some campaign statements as B statements, ones that emphasize the importance of the outcome. You know, things are going to be great if our guy wins, and they're going to be terrible if the other person wins. So B statements, can they implicitly say, vote for me because I'll bring about better outcomes, or vote for me because my opponent will bring about bad outcomes? On average, 88% of messages that we coded were B messages. The theory I'll lay out in a moment emphasizes how people can be moved to the polls by their internal drives, even in the absence of mobilization. If mobilization efforts of campaigns were the whole story, then we would expect turnout to be considerably higher in geographic regions where campaigning is intense than in places that campaigns ignore. And this is true in the United States as an artifact of the electoral college system. We have so-called safe states and so-called battleground states, and the vast majority of resources in presidential campaigns, estimates go as high as 90%, are invested in battleground states, so safe states are pretty much ignored. You could be kind of, if you were a Martian and dropped into Connecticut, for example, where I lived during a presidential campaign, you might well not know that there was a campaign going on because it's a safe state, and there's very little campaigning that happens there. So if this were all about mobilization, you would expect turnout to be much higher in the battleground states. The difference in turnout between presidential, the picture I'm showing you here is the difference in turnout between presidential and midterm congressional elections. And it's quite large, about 16 percentage points on average in elections between 1960 and 2016. The average differences in turnout between battleground and safe states is very small, on average 1 or 2 percentage points. Gerber and his co-authors confirmed these magnitudes in statistical models that include baseline turnout, changes in battleground status, and state fixed effects. They conclude, and I'll quote from them, that turnout is primarily linked to factors affecting the entire electorate, such as the social importance of presidential elections, rather than factors that influence just a portion of the country, such as intensive campaigning and mobilization efforts, or a greater chance of casting a decisive vote. I will just briefly mention that the literature, the field experiment literature on elections, there's a nice review of this work that Arsenault and Nickerson did in 2009. And they basically show that the most powerful techniques, so get out the vote experiments are ones in which the researchers do some intervention during a campaign and then observe what difference it makes in the turnout rate. And these interventions are typically things like varying the kind of canvassing that parties or campaigns do, different kinds of, to some extent, different kinds of messages. And the biggest differences that they find are less than 10%. So at the best case scenario in a field experiment, you can increase the turnout by about 10 percentage points, but that's very much on the high end. On the other hand, Arsenault and Nickerson note that the difference in turnout between local elections and presidential elections is about 3 times. So, 3 times the number of people turn out to vote in national elections compared to local elections. Now, what I'm trying to argue to you is that's all about B. So, André Blay, who is a very prominent comparative scholar of turnout, has found something very similar. Let me turn to the question of closeness of races. Another factor in our model, as I'll present in a moment, that matters in turnout is how close a race looks like it's going to be. And that's something that other people have observed as well, other scholars have observed as well. And it's easy to sort of jump to the conclusion that that's a kind of support for the Riker and Ordashov kind of framework, because that means that people, when a race is going to be close, they think that their vote might be pivotal. So then P goes up to a kind of an observable greater than 0 value, and then B should matter as well. Well, there's actually very little evidence that people think about P the way kind of a mathematically oriented social scientist might. They don't actually think about, or they actually do think about it the way a mathematical social scientist would, in the sense that they don't really think that that's what they're doing when they go to the polls, even in close races. So our own research and research by André Blay and others has looked directly at this question: do people grossly overestimate the likelihood of a tied election in which a single vote would make the difference? And the answer is basically no. So this is a survey results in which we asked respondents how likely their vote was to break a tie in a presidential race. Most of them gave what's basically the right answer from a mathematical standpoint. And that is, less than 1 million in one, with an emphasis on less than. And Blay has similar results from some empirical work that he did. A paper by Bigness and co-authors, I'll just mention, reporting on field and survey experiments. They tell people that the race is going to be close, and that did increase turnout, but then they ask people afterwards in a survey, does that increase turnout because you think it might be a tie or for some other reasons? And it basically looks like it makes people just feel more engaged and excited about the race, without changing their really changing that sort of P term. Let me turn to the question of the impact of costs on turnout. In the series I've been discussing, when costs of participation rise, participation falls. But sometimes that's not so obviously true. In the United States, some states have implemented in recent years very strict voter ID rules, laws. This means that if you go in South Carolina or Alabama to vote, you have to bring positive proof of who you are to the polling place, which might be a birth certificate. So these are fairly onerous kind of documentation requirements. And no secret that these have been efforts to suppress turnout rates among low income and in particular African American voters. So these efforts, these laws, obviously raise the cost of participation. But what's interesting is that it's been shown that the rates of participation actually do not fall very much. And in fact, in some cases they appear to increase, and increase among the voters who are presumably being targeted by them. So I'm drawing here on research by Valentino and Neuner, and by Citrin and his co-authors. In protests as well, sometimes costs of participation rise and protests grow. Imagine a situation in which a relatively small number of protesters is demonstrating, and they are met with very harsh measures by the police, let's say tear gas, pepper spray, rubber bullets. Probably doesn't happen in Sweden, but it does happen in other parts of the world. These police actions increase the cost of participation, so we expect protesters to go home and bystanders to be dissuaded from joining. But not infrequently, the opposite happens. As an example, in Turkey in 2013, there was a small group of environmental protesters called Taksim Solidarity who were camped out in Gezi Park, which is right next to Taksim Square in central Istanbul. They were trying to keep the government from carrying out an urban development project where they were going to basically pave over Gezi Park, which is a small park, and build a shopping mall and a mosque. On May 28th, local Istanbul police attacked the occupiers. So these were people camping out, and they were doused with pepper spray at close range, as was this young woman. Their tents were burned. They were subjected to water cannons and the like. This was an image taken by a Reuters photographer, and it became so widely viewed and notorious. It became known as she became known as the woman in red. The outcome, the result, was not an ending of the protests, but the repression of these early risers instead was followed by massive protests, which you probably remember reading about. They spread from Istanbul to Ankara and Izmir and other cities, and it became a national uprising. This backlash dynamic is not uncommon and was very much at work in Brazil's anti-bus fare increase protest, which happened just about the same time as the Gezi uprising. The Euromaidan protests in Ukraine also began after special police forces attacked a small group of protesters who were lingering in the Maidan early in the morning of November 30th, 2013. And there are other cases that one might point to. The Hong Kong umbrella movement had a similar kind of dynamic. Why is it not infrequently the case that the costs of protesting go up and demonstrations surge? theorists are not wrong to consider costs as a factor in participation decisions. But I want to suggest to you that they think about costs in a one-sided way. Just as there are costs of participation, so there are costs of abstention. The former are material and cognitive, the latter are social and psychological, but no less real for that. To give a sense of the intuition here, I worry, as many people do, about climate change, and that concern makes me think about the ways in which my family wastes fossil fuels and contributes to greenhouse gases. If I'm riding the car and my husband is driving and we stop someplace and he leaves the car idling, I experience a sensation that is kind of close to physical pain, and I have an urge to lean over and turn the car off. Turning the car off I know it won't make a discernible difference in global climate change. But if I pause to ponder that fact, I might not be able to stop myself from trying to turn the car off. My reaction is not the result of moral reflection, though if I did reflect on the situation from a moral standpoint, I might take the same action. I might say to myself, well, I should do things that I want everybody else to do and so forth. But what I'm talking about is much more of a kind of a gut urge. So if you don't understand that there are costs of even talking about turning the car off in that kind of situation, you've probably not ever been in a long-term relationship. This would be a very costly action, to say the least, and I will also add that my husband hates this story and he has his own stories. So when the act of wanting to turn the car off has its equivalent in politics. When people care a lot about the outcome of collective action, let's say who is to become the next president or prime minister, or whether an urban park is to be turned into a shopping mall, or how the police treat protesters, they experience dissonance or friction or unhappiness, negative emotional states that people seek to alleviate by acting. These reactions are equal part cognition and emotion. Erdem, Aytaç, and I developed a decision-theoretic model of people's participation decisions, which takes into account both the cost of participation and the cost of abstention. Elections and protests are different in several ways. Still, with small modifications, we're able to apply our model of costly abstention to both forms of citizen action. Let me briefly mention the factors in the model. They include costs of abstention, which are intrinsic, we define as intrinsic and psychological, and we use the letter A to capture this factor. It includes B, which we follow Riker and Ordershock in thinking about as how much a person cares about the outcome of collective action, the relative utility benefits of one or another outcome. How important it seems, how much seems to be at stake to a person plays an important role in our theory. We also include in our model a measure of closeness, or a term that captures the notion of closeness, which we use gamma as notation. We'll see that competitiveness boosts people's cost of abstention, both because they become more engaged in close races, and because they can be induced to think about this strategic situation from a supra-individual standpoint. They kind of think like a party. Another important factor are costs of participation. We follow the literature in thinking about these as material and financial costs, for instance, those involved in getting to the polls. There are also opportunity costs of the time involved, and cognitive costs of figuring out how to cast one's ballot. We use the letter D to convey the norms and social expectations that encourage people to participate. We follow Gerber and co-authors in conceiving the duty to vote as decomposable into intrinsic and extrinsic aspects. Intrinsic D can be subsumed under what we're calling costs of abstention. Hence, we expect people's sense of duty to intensify in elections they see as important and recede in elections that they don't see as important. And notice that that's a very different treatment of D than the Riker and Ordershock one, where it just sort of sits off by itself and is kind of a trait of individuals rather than something that might vary. We also include an extrinsic duty term, D sub E, as a separate factor that encourages people to turn out as it rises. Our model is represented in this system of equations. A person's rewards from participation, capital P here, are a function of her cost of abstention minus her cost of participation, plus the value she derives from complying with norms and social expectations. The costs of abstention, in turn, are a function of B, how much she cares about the outcome. Regarding close elections, to the extent that she cares about the outcome and it appears to be close, her costs of abstention rise. On the other hand, even if an election is not close, how much she cares about the outcome still influences her decision about whether to vote or abstain. Turning next to the theory of protest participation, we posit again that people face both costs of participation and costs of abstention. A person's willingness to demonstrate depends on their cost of abstention and cost of participation, as I just mentioned, defined as I did before. D is also relevant. We don't usually think of there being a general civic norm in favor of participation in protests. People's sense of a kind of duty to do so is more likely to be related to particular groups, acquaintances, fellow travelers, and the like. A difference, how much people care about the outcome influences their participation decisions, and the reason is that it influences their the cost of abstention. A difference between voting and protesting is there's not a meaningful sense of closeness in protest. The intuition of many scholars is that numbers matter. People are drawn to protests that they expect to be large and stay away when they expect them or observe them to be small. So instead of gamma, we have n, the number of other protesters or people protesting or expected to do so. N appears in the second equation interacting with B to influence the magnitude of cost of abstention. This interaction means that people are not drawn to take part in large demonstrations if they don't agree with the protesters. Another interpretation of N is that there's a sort of safety in numbers component. People don't feel as exposed in large demonstrations as in small ones. This is the interpretation of N as it appears in the third equation as moderating the impact of repression on costs of participation. Regarding repression, we model it as having an ambiguous effect of driving up both costs of abstention and costs of participation. Because repression can increase both, you have to look at the net effects. So this is just a sort of a diagram that illustrates the kind of joint effect of costs of participation and costs of abstention, or if you will, as a function of levels of repression, or if you will, sort of fear and anger effects. The line labeled A depicts the cost of abstention a person experiences, which rise as a function of repression. The curve labeled C depicts the cost of participation, which also rise as a function of repression, but we're saying here in a nonlinear way. The inverted U-shaped curve is the vertical difference between these two functions. Initially, as the level of repression rises, the person's probability of joining also rises, as the increase in cost of abstention outpace those of participation. But at higher levels of repression, think Tiananmen Square, this probability declines and the individual becomes more likely to remain or return home. I'm now going to describe some of the ways that we've tested our model empirically. Our book manuscript, as I mentioned, includes many tests and explorations of observable implications, so I'm just going to mention a few. We study importance or B effects. In voting, we study B alone and in interaction with closeness or gamma. Recall that our expectation is that closeness only matters for people who care about the outcome. We delve into the idea of psychic costs of abstention by measuring people's reactions to participating or not being able to participate, both in elections and protests. To do that, we use a measurement tool. In the context of some experiments, we use a measurement tool commonly used by psychologists, the positive and negative affect schedule. Basically, this involves asking people about their experience of a set of emotions linked to specific outcomes or events. We rely pretty heavily on experimental evidence, and this is because it's really helpful in dealing with some problems of observational equivalence and potential endogeneity of various kinds. So, for example, do apparently important elections attract more people to the polls because they care more about the outcome, or because these elections are covered heavily by the media, and so that it requires less cognitive effort to figure out who they support, or even just an election is going on. To be clear, both kinds of factors matter, but we're interested in discerning internal drives that get people to the polls when they care, because that's what's sort of theoretically distinctive, and also that's the problem that we find undermines the inherited theories. So I'll just say that in general the results are in line with our expectations. I think if they hadn't been, we would have changed our theory, hopefully. So when this is an experiment where we ask people, it was a hypothetical situation in which we asked people about their willingness to vote in an election that were where there were sort of basically 4 treatments, a combination of closeness and importance. So you had an important close election, an important not close election, an unimportant close election, an unimportant not close election. And what you can basically see there is that the importance, closeness matters, but only in the context of an important election. And important elections, those are statistically significant, significantly higher. The scale is just a kind of question. The answers have to do with how willing a person was to vote. So that sort of supports the notion that both closeness and importance matter, but closeness only in interaction with importance. We also kind of tried to dig into this notion of cost of abstention as a kind of as undergirded by kind of emotional reactions. So in another experiment, we had people imagine that they had to they found themselves having to sit out elections, which could either be, again, close or not close, and important or not important in their view, and ask them about their emotional responses. And we asked them about emotions like distress, anger, and upset. You can see that the levels of these negative emotions are higher. Those are statistically significantly higher levels of those emotions in the important and close elections. Our next move was to try to see whether people feel distressed, angry, and upset because they are really thinking it's not an inherent reaction that they have. It doesn't have to do with sort of these internalized costs of abstention, but rather it has to do with the sort of social context of voting and the expectation that they might feel embarrassed or ashamed if people they know were to discover that they had abstained. So we asked a set of questions that were meant to distinguish between this sort of intrinsic and various versions of the extrinsic kind of shame situations. And what we basically found was that what we were looking for is it all about sort of social context and extrinsic shame, or do internal emotional states also play a role? And what we actually found was that these internal emotional states, at least in these experiments, played a bigger role than say the fact that you might have to report to your friends or acquaintances that you had sat out an election. So we take this to be confirmation of the kind of the concept of cost of abstention as, in part at least, a kind of internalized drive state. Okay, let me turn briefly to the empirical work we've done on protests. We carried out extensive research in 3 countries, as I mentioned, that had recently experienced major protests, or in the case of Ukraine, the protests were ongoing at the time of our research. All 3 of these are new democracies. I can talk more about sort of case selection. We're not treating them as cases in a traditional sense, but we were interested in in part in the notion that costs can rise, cost of participation can rise, and yet cost of abstention also rise. So we were interested in the phenomenon of protests that are repressed, and that's actually something that's much more common in new democracies or consolidating democracies than in established ones. And that was one of the reasons we studied these particular cases, in addition to wanting to use experimental techniques which are much facilitated by either the protests being ongoing or recently having been concluded. I'll just say that we used a lot of observational data that indicated that the actual sort of explicit policy goals, to the extent that there were some, and in each of these three cases there were policy goals of the protests, that those goals go a really long way to explaining why people turned out. I can talk more about that. I won't go into detail about it now. So as in our work on voting, we're also interested in exploring the cost of abstention and the emotional effects of participation. In all three countries we worked in, we carried out survey experiments in which people were exposed to verbal frames that emphasize protesters' goals, the size of protests, so that's kind of looking at the impact of N, and repression on people's willingness to join in. When people learned about attacks against protesters or perceived them to be unjustified, we learned through our research they experienced anger and moral outrage, which in turn encouraged people to go to the streets despite the dangers and costs. But that was only true among people who were in sympathy with what the protesters were about, and also who identified in some kind of ideological or partisan or cultural way with the protesters. These emotional reactions are very much what we have in mind with the concept of costly abstention. So this image, the image on the left here, shows Kiev on November 30th, 2013 at about 4 in the morning. The Berkut, which was a special force of police force, was cracking down on a small group of protesters. So here you have the repression taking place, and the picture on the right is an image from the same Maidan Square on December 1st, so almost immediately after the crackdown. And you can see again that rather than ending the protest, the repression appears at least to have had the effect of exploding it into a very, very large movement. Interviews with people who became involved in the protest point toward the kinds of emotional reactions that we're talking about with costly repression, very much like the emotions that I was describing myself having in the car, when the car is idling. So for example, we talked to a person named Dmitry Bulatov, who was a founder of a group called Auto Maidan, which was the group that ferried people back and forth. They were car enthusiasts who ferried people back and forth to the protests as they were going on. And he talked to us about his experience the morning of December 1st when he learned about the Berkut's attacks. So you can see here, he said, the police were attempting to take this girl toward a police vehicle, whereas my friend tried to rescue her from the police and take her toward an ambulance because she had been beaten and was covered in blood. Only then I turned on the television, opened the internet, and speaking honestly and plainly, I became enraged. You know, there are sometimes moments when you feel like you're coming apart because it's no longer possible to tolerate the situation. We phoned some friends to tell them that we had put together a car protest. So one explanation of why protests get very large when there's repression is the one that I'm offering you, which is that it essentially evokes a kind of moral and emotional reaction, which we're talking about in terms of a heightening of cost of abstention, and people are encouraged to come out in the streets. But that's not the only plausible explanation for backlash movements. Others are more cognitive and information-oriented. So Suzanne Lohmann, writing about the Monday protests in Leipzig in 1989, makes an argument of the kind I've just been describing, a kind of more cognitive information argument, as do Mehdi Shadmer and Raphael Boleslavsky, who were writing about post-election protests in 2009 in Iran. These theorists postulate that repression changes bystanders' assessments of the strength of the regime, the strength of the opposition, the capacity of the opposition to mobilize people, or it induces people to change their beliefs about the type of government they're living under. They previously thought that it was a benign government. They come to understand it as a nefarious government because of acts of repression, and that has a mobilizing effect. So this last part I'm going to talk to you about, coming toward the end here, we wanted to basically adjudicate between these two kinds of explanations. Our explanation that has to do with costs of abstention, and another kind of explanation that's much more cognitive and informational. So we designed a follow-up survey in Istanbul to, again, sort of adjudicate between cognitive and emotional explanations of why repression can spur activism. And I'm just going to end by offering some of this evidence. Recall that in the mass uprising in Turkey that came after a police crackdown on a small group of people who were occupying Gezi Park. Eventually, after 2 weeks, the government deployed an enormous force against the protesters and retook first Taksim Square and then Gezi Park. That was in 2013. Early in 2015, we took advantage of renewed attention to the park and the government's plans to do a follow-up experiment. Basically, the government kind of floated a trial balloon by saying that they had set aside money in the municipal budget of Istanbul to develop Gezi. That got a lot of press coverage. It got people kind of worked up about the issue, and we took advantage of that situation to do a follow-up experiment. What we basically did was to expose an online sample of adults in Istanbul to images that either reminded them of the repression that had happened with the Gezi protests in 2013, or reminded them about the sort of numbers of people who took part, sort of a more positive image of large numbers of people taking part in the protests. And we also had a control group in which they didn't see any images, and then we had a placebo group that saw a very pretty picture of sort of Istanbul skyline at night, sort of a postcard-like picture. As outcome questions, we asked people their opinions of the ruling party and the opposition. So in a Lohmann kind of world, what repression should do is change people's views, people's sort of beliefs about the government. We also asked them of their opinions of the AKP, the ruling party. Again, that would be a kind of a more Lohmann type mechanism. And then we asked them again a series of questions about their emotional states and their willingness to take part in protests, should protests happen again around the Gezi issue. So this is just the image of the text that goes with the repression treatment. We tried not to call it that when we applied for IRB support. I'm just going to go through this very quickly again, sort of a set of questions, outcome questions that are sort of Lohmann and Shadmer type predictions that there would be changes in beliefs about the government, changes in preferences, and then we ask questions about the emotional states of our distinct treatment groups. So the regressions in this table allow us to assess the impact of reminders of repression on emotional responses as well as on subjects' beliefs and political preferences. Notice that repression only increases people's anger. It does not change their beliefs about the likely effectiveness of protests or the strengths or confidence in the government. These effects hold among CHP supporters, so opposition party supporters. So here we have a full causal chain from repression to anger, from anger to mobilization, but only among opposition party supporters. A couple of other things to note here. The repression treatment also made AKP or ruling party supporters more angry. They were probably angered by the image of protesters, not the police repressing the protesters. Keep in mind that Erdogan put out, the then Prime Minister of Turkey kind of gave a kind of narrative around the protests in which they were a kind of part of a plot against Turkey that was being undertaken by Soros, by the Americans, by the Israelis, take your pick. And 80% of people who are AKP supporters believe that to be true in surveys, and only 20% of CHP supporters or opposition party supporters believe that. So that's probably what explains that emotional response. And recall also that AKP supporters in the repression treatment were not more likely to join a protest, so that causal chain is not complete. Also notice that the placebo seemed to have a calming effect on people's emotions. I wish I could show it to you. It is really a calming picture, so for what it's worth. So the evidence thus far suggests that repression did not make opposition supporters dislike the government more or view it as more vulnerable. It simply angered them, and their anger encouraged them to take part in collective action, or at least say that they would. To further investigate what mediates the effect of repression on mobilization, we used formal mediation analysis. Our goal was to identify the average causal mediation effect, basically what portion of the effect of repression on protest operates through these mediating variables. So we explored two potential mediators, emotions and opinions of the government. These were the only two that were influenced by the repression treatment. Our measure of emotions, again, is the Panas anger response. Our measure of preferences is views of the AKP, the ruling party. We build on recent advances in mediation analysis to study the simultaneous influence of two mediators on an outcome. As recommended by Imai and Yamamoto, we introduce controls for potential confounders, in this case, age, gender, and level of education. Anger is the only effective mediator between repression and protest, in the full sample and among CHP supporters. So if you take a look at the mediation results, just for subjects who support the CHP, the opposition, and that's 32% of our sample, in this model we simultaneously assess mediation effects of anger and support for the AKP. The corresponding average conditional mediation effect is 0.453, and the total effect is 0.69, and this means that 77% of the total effect of the repression treatment on CHP supporters' willingness to protest is channeled through anger. The analysis doesn't return significant mediation effects for preferences for the ruling party. So we've offered, I'm probably just about out of time, right? Yes. Let me just then conclude. When people weigh whether to take part in collective action, the cost both of participation and of abstention bear on their choices. Costs of abstention mount when they think there's a lot at stake for themselves or in general. Efforts to suppress participation, voter ID laws, harsh treatment from the police, can drive up both the cost of participation and of abstention. So we have to look at the net effects. Obstacles to collective action are overcome in many ways, but one that has not been sufficiently appreciated is an internalized dissonance and drive to take part when something important is at stake. So thank you very much.